I feel this quite a distinct audience tonight on Education Day. I think, new faces compared to the launch of the report earlier today. So allow me please to introduce a little bit in a couple of words our report. My name is Manos Antoninis. I am Senior Policy Analyst at the Global Education Monitoring Report. This is an editorially independent and evidence-based report, which is published by UNESCO. And the mandate that we received from the international community in 2015 is to progress towards education objectives in the new Sustainable Development Goal agenda. And today at COP22, we were very happy and very proud to present a part of our report, which was launched 2 months ago, copies of which you can find actually at the entrance on the table. This is called Planet, Education for Environmental Sustainability and Green Growth. And as I said, it's part of our full-scale report, the first in the new series, which had 2 objectives this year. The first, to document the challenges in monitoring the new education in the new Sustainable Development Agenda, including Target 4.7, which focuses specifically on education for sustainable development and global citizenship. And secondly, the objective was to also link education to the other 16 Sustainable Development Goals, examine the interrelationships. So today I will be sharing some of the relevant findings related to indigenous groups. But I could say, first of all, that the report for a number of years now has been championing the issue of leaving no one behind. We have been looking at utilizing household surveys from now more than 160 countries, documenting inequalities in both education participation and attainment, as well as in learning outcomes, and showing how aspects related to gender, to location, to wealth, to ethnicity, and especially their interactions have a really major impact on the educational opportunities of people around the world. Of course, this agenda, the COP, also reminds us that education, through Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, calls on parties to emphasize measures related to climate change education, to training, to public awareness, public participation, and public access to information. And these strategies should be part of any national plan towards the intended nationally determined contributions. And that is, of course, very highly on our minds. But before we reach that moment, let us not forget that we have to ensure that every child and young person and adult gets the education opportunities that they deserve in order to meet the objectives of the agenda. So just a few words. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development commits to leaving no one behind. Yet we face major equity challenges in education. The most disadvantaged children continue to be the last to benefit. Let me tell you that the first target of Sustainable Development Goal 4 is that all young people will complete secondary education. Currently, we stand at 43% attainment rate, completion rate. However, in low-income countries, poor girls have only 1 in 100 chances of completing secondary school at the moment. So we're talking about really vast inequalities. And indigenous populations are often among the most disadvantaged groups. And that often means that their education gaps are even worse than their health or other welfare gaps. And that refers to indigenous groups in all continents, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. So marginalization in education is not an issue simply of access and attainment, but also of content. Let us not forget that. Officially sanctioned content conveyed through curricula, textbooks, and assessment may privilege the language, the knowledge, and the history and culture of some groups and not the others. This is especially true for indigenous groups, for whom education is often seen as both the reason that indigenous knowledge is lost and a potential way to restore it. Yet, despite vulnerability, many indigenous communities maintain lifestyles and engage in practices that contribute to the sustainability aspirations of the new SDG agenda. Formal education systems, often conceptualized under Western norms or other national norms, have often promoted a homogeneous approach to education rather than plurality. This has led to denial and destruction of indigenous knowledge. But indigenous communities, we shouldn't forget, are stewards of traditional environmental knowledge. Most indigenous people share norms and values that are central to sustainable livelihoods. To ensure that education systems are supporting and not destroying local knowledge systems, they should promote diversity in curricula and establish policies and programs that protect and respect local languages. Community elders should be engaged, and school governance should respect that. Most definitions of sustainable development challenge the status quo, believing that human development lacks meaning without a healthy planet. This view requires people, communities, and nations to reconsider basic values of daily living and change the way they think. Understanding one's own values, the values of one's community and society, and those of others around the world is a central part of educating for a sustainable future. Traditional, especially indigenous knowledge in such areas as agriculture, food production, and conservation has played an important role in environmental sustainability for centuries. And more recently, it has contributed to disaster early warning systems, climate change adaptation, and resilience. Traditional, and specifically indigenous knowledge, passed down through the generations, is a major resource for adapting to climate change. Indigenous people live in some of the most vulnerable ecosystems, ranging from the Arctic, high mountains, floodplains, and tropical rainforests to the margins of deserts, small islands, and low coastal areas. Indigenous territories are directly affected by the crisis that has brought climate change and loss of biodiversity. Despite hostile conditions, however, many indigenous peoples thrive, finding ways to resist and adapt to environmental changes, mainly due to their deep knowledge and relationship with the environment. Numerous examples of indigenous communities' traditional land management practices are being recognized globally for conserving biodiversity and maintaining ecosystem processes. Conservationists and researchers acknowledge the huge scale of biodiversity, rich terrestrial and marine habitats that are successfully managed outside government-designated protected areas. Estimated to be roughly equal to the size of total protected areas, indigenous conserved areas and sacred natural sites are often managed as well as or more effectively than comparable government-managed areas. For example, research shows that such sites have been more effective in tackling rainforest deforestation by reducing logging and forest fires, thus contributing to rainforest critical functions as biodiversity hotspots and carbon sinks, places that absorb more carbon, as you know, than they release. Small island developing states use the entire education system to prepare for climate change. The Pacific Island region will experience some of the most profound negative effects of climate change considerably sooner than the other regions. The Pacific Islands Climate Education Partnership aims to educate the region's students and citizens in ways that exemplify modern science and indigenous environmental knowledge, address the urgency of climate change, and honor indigenous culture. Students and citizens in the region will have the knowledge and skills to advance their understanding of climate change and adapt to its impact. The partnership promotes indigenous knowledge and practices, enhances learning and teaching about climate change from kindergarten all the way up to teacher training, supports a community school partnership program to connect schools with community partners working on climate adaptation, and focuses on the content and skills necessary for students to understand the science of global and Pacific Islands climates. Current activities include revising state and national science education standards to better incorporate climate change, adapting curricula to a wide variety of climate and education contexts, gathering local indigenous knowledge related to climate adaptation, providing professional development, and supporting local professional communities. The strong Western focus of education systems and institutions around the world impedes meaningful inclusion of indigenous populations and their knowledge and practices within the formal schooling system. Research has documented how formal schooling systems have resulted in the loss of significant background knowledge about nature, culture, and values that indigenous children previously acquired in their own communities. However, while education can cause a loss of indigenous knowledge, it can also be a cure. It is therefore essential to foster dialogue and create partnerships between indigenous populations, civil society, government, development partners, and management agencies, as well as scholars from a range of disciplines, to promote conservation of such knowledge and its integration in various initiatives. Curricula should value indigenous language and be relevant to local contexts, and students should be supported to learn in their home language. To conclude my presentation, I do hope that you do take a copy of our Planet Education for Environmental Sustainability and Green Growth report that you can find at the entrance. And as you understand, the findings and recommendations of this report speak to many different audiences. I'm very happy to be actually addressing you tonight. And one thing is clear, that we really need to work together. Please do join in the conversation, and feel free to download the full report at the sites on this slide. Thank you very much.
Education is not going in one direction, and that actually by educating indigenous peoples, you actually return. And my home organization is the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, where we particularly promote learning from indigenous practices, because very often, and more than not, they can teach us actually how to adapt to climate change. So the question is really, how do you communicate scientific findings on one side? How do you communicate what's going on in the political field and international negotiations? How do you do that in a culturally adapted way? And how do you get back knowledge and solutions that you really need in a climate change world? I have a first panel here with two fantastic experts. To my right, on the far right here, is Luisa Manuofetor. I hope I pronounced that correctly, from Tonga. She's the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Social Protection and Disability Division in the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Her job is to protect vulnerable people from climate change and natural disaster. And the question on how to communicate and how to learn, how to promote learning about these issues is at the core of your work, Luisa. Could you explain us how you do that in Tonga? We've seen one slide already, a bit in this direction, but we are eager to learn from you what you do in Tonga. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. I would like to say malolele to everyone here from Tonga. I'm sure that all of you have been hearing of it, the very excellent presentation from my colleague here. And for this opportunity, I'd like to concentrate on three things that I think is very important tonight that we focus on. First, the question of who are people that we may overlook in terms of climate change, and second, how can we better reach them, and also the third, the challenges and the opportunities. I think that with the people that we may overlook, is I think the focus of tonight is very much focusing on people that are vulnerable, and as with the other region in the Pacific, some categories of people are more likely to be overlooked, including but not limited to persons with disabilities, the elderly, the women and children with psychological individuals, and poor people or people living under extreme hardship. Categories, however, have a tendency to be seen as exhaustive. Therefore, many individuals and groups continue to be overlooked. However, vulnerability in Tonga is not an attribute, but usually stems from multiple, often invisible inequalities or disadvantages. People without land rights, for example, often are not an official list which programs, including climate change education, rely on. Furthermore, in the Pacific, for example, literacy levels, remoteness of islands, accessibility, as well as diverse cultural and historical nuances, etc., can contribute to people missing out on climate change education. How then can we better reach them is my focus tonight. And before we can adequately reach the people being left behind, we need to identify and understand the factors contributing to inequality. And this will require resources and capacity. Information about climate change education must be made available in different forums. The community leaders are crucial, but communication should not solely rely on village leaders due to underlying inequalities. I'm talking from experience here because a lot of us are working with the community, especially the town offices and the district offices, and we find that we have to be very careful when we work with the vulnerable people, especially relying on our own people. Other avenues such as the church, schools, etc., should also be explored. Targeted education in a variety of formats, including through using range of formats to cater for disability. In many cases, the role of the caregiver is critical. So I'd like tonight to, with this opportunity to share the best practice from Tonga regarding how are we going to better reach these people. The social protection and disability focal point of is where I am the head servant, embarked on what we call the universal household approach, caregivers training to an extreme person with marginalized function. And what is known in our language as the Mckay caregivers training. The approach stems from the fact that the cultural context of the island have very strong communal tie. The application to the vulnerable individual at home is the responsibility of the traditional family or the extension family members. So to address their needs and assist them in their cultural context, carers at home must be included in the vulnerable empowerment such as life skills training, included the climate change training and natural disaster and awareness training program. These individuals also do not have access to formal education because of their carer duties, and these are mostly women. And also the vulnerable person are cared for at home. In our experiences, the people at the house or the family members understand the languages of their vulnerable better than anyone, whether they are deaf, mute, or blind, or even psychosocial. This approach is not limited only to the carer. The training is available for the whole household to attend, with the understanding that the family are all responsible for the vulnerable person when the time comes. And on the whole, we believe that with this approach, the universal household approach, no one is safe from climate change education. I must admit that we have challenges in this approach, knowing the fact that we just started this approach last year. And while we captured the vulnerable person who may be left behind in the formal education sectors with reference to climate change, we believe that there's a positive outlook from Paris Agreement to the inclusion in the formal education sector plans. Another challenge is the uncertainty of what the future holds for traditional farmers in the face of shrinking global economies, where strong family tie may not be able to withstand. Another challenge that we also face is the capacity of teachers and trainers and the carers needed to be strengthened, and skills and knowledge to be made available also to others of same purpose. The language complexity and its application, also the lack of resources in personnel, learning materials, and training equipments. While we have these challenges, I have to admit that we also presented with the opportunities to include vulnerable persons in the design of formal climate change education, as well as the opportunity to do research work on formal module designed specifically for the vulnerable person in climate change education, and also the opportunity to mainstream the vulnerable person in climate change in formal education curriculum. We also have the opportunity here to recognize that participation alone will not be sufficient. Inclusion requires positive steps to understand the needs of marginalized person in order to tailor climate change education. That's where we are from Tonga. And I think what I'm trying here is to capture the question of where we are with the vulnerable person, how to reach these people so that they are not left behind with the climate change education. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And out of my own experience, I can confirm that this is a two-way learning experience. In a previous life, I led a delegation in the Convention for the Right of People with Disabilities. And we also had people with learning disabilities. And when you talk to them, they have three cards, a red, a yellow, and a green one. So you speak and they hold up a green card, you're fine. They hold up a yellow card, they have difficulties understanding. They hold up a red card, you're forced to go back and say the same thing that you said before, but in simpler words. And I can tell you, nothing prevents, excuse my French, bullshitting more than having an audience who asks questions and forces you to say what you have to say in very clear words. And in very clear words, I would like to introduce my next panelist, Jamie Webb from the United Nations Environmental Programme, whose work is all about communicating and learning experiences about the environment. And the question we have heard is, how do you tailor the learning? I mean, how do you bring together the communities that need learning and you tailor the learning experiences to what these communities have produced themselves in learning? How do you bring these things together, Jamie?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'll keep my eyes out for any red cards out there. But I wanted to start by sharing an experience. And it's from a former life when I worked for the Convention on Biodiversity. And we organized a meeting in Finland with Arctic indigenous peoples, and it was on climate change. And as part of the meeting, we started talking about how Sami people know when to mix their herds. And it's actually really interesting. So basically what happens is that every once in a while, you feel the fur on the belly of a reindeer, which I imagine you do very carefully. And if it gets rough, then that's an indication that you need to mix the herds. You need to bring in new genetic material. So you get a couple of herds together at the right time of the year, and next thing you know, you've got soft belly fur again. So the same meeting, then I said, okay, well, this knowledge is very interesting. But what is needed in order to integrate this knowledge into our education systems? And the indigenous peoples attending this meeting had some very clear answers for me. They said, we need pilot programs for indigenous monitoring systems. If indigenous people are involved in gathering material, the information on climate change and its impacts and its repercussions, then people will start to respect our traditional knowledge. Secondly, they said that we need recognizable validation mechanisms for traditional science. So they said, you go to a journal like Science or Nature, and they say, has it been peer reviewed? There's this established mechanism for, how many times is it referenced? How many things do you reference? Well, this isn't valid for traditional knowledge. So they said, we need to come up with a new system, a system that's just as valid, just as important, just as recognizable as the peer review system, but doesn't enforce a set of criteria which are not relevant for traditional knowledge. And finally, they said, we need to respect the holders of traditional knowledge. They said, you don't know how many times we've had a scientist show up in our community and they walk around and they ask a bunch of questions and they have their iPads and they enter all the answers and they disappear. And we never hear from them again. And we don't know what science they generated, and they certainly aren't giving it back to us, but it's science about our community. And how can people generate science about our community and not share it with us? So, we came up with these guidelines and said, all right, this is important. We now say we recognize the value of indigenous and traditional knowledge and that we want to bring it into our system. But then what we found is that we weren't able to generate this type of knowledge. We weren't able to generate interest in this type of knowledge among non-traditional holders. And there's a very specific example I'd like to share with you. So UN Environment and the government of Peru launched a certificate program on biodiversity and intercultural dialogues. The program won awards and received accolades, and it was amazing. It was groundbreaking. Everybody loved it. However, it was very difficult to generate interest in this program amongst non-Indigenous peoples. And after a year, the program folded. So this showed us that the question isn't just about integrating traditional knowledge, innovations, and practices into our education system. It's about changing our appetite to learn from, respect, and contribute to this knowledge. And this is a much bigger challenge. And this is a challenge that we need to face every day. We need to work in partnership with our teachers, with our educators, in order to help build awareness of the value of bringing in alternative perspectives. Because until we can convince people that this is an important step to take, it will not happen, and it will not be sustainable. And until that happens, we can't reach out and meet the learning needs of Indigenous peoples. We can't show and demonstrate how their knowledge is integral to our understanding of the world, our ability to address climate change. But the problem doesn't lie with traditional knowledge. The problem doesn't lie with Indigenous peoples. It lies with the rest of us and our ability to respect, absorb, and contribute back to this very, very important body of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's not forget that climate change is new for all of us. So this is a collective learning experience, and who claims to have found the silver bullet might not be right. We have limited time, but I do have time to take questions. I don't think we have a roaming microphone. You can either shout loud or just come and take my microphone. I'm happy to share it. Is there any questions in the room to our first two panelists on integrating Indigenous knowledge and communicating climate change and creating a learning experience which is beneficial for both sides? There's a roaming microphone. It's getting better and better. So I'm a little bit blinded. There was, yes. Please, the gentleman in the white t-shirt.
Hi, my name's Matthew. I'm a teaching graduate from New Zealand. My question is, how would you imagine the systems of incorporating Indigenous knowledge into existing Western systems or national systems? How would you imagine that working in formal schooling contexts such as curriculums?
Thank you very much. I could take a second question. All the way on the other side. Okay.
For traditional knowledge. How do you suggest we do that?
Thank you. So, please, the gentleman in the middle.
The knowledge that the community has, at times, it's oral, it's not documented. How do we then ensure that this knowledge is not lost? Because the people who have got it are the elders who, as they pass on, this knowledge gradually disappears.
Well, thank you very much. I would take my privilege and add a fourth question, which is basically, if the climate is changing, the traditional knowledge of one area might actually be precisely what another area needs. How do you transfer that? Who wants to go first? 4 questions. The one I just said, the question about formal education and how to integrate that in formal education. How do we increase our appetite for Indigenous knowledge and for exchange? And the question of how you bring oral tradition and oral stories, knowledge from the elders into the learning experience. You want to go first, please?
I think my response will be to address what the New Zealand gentleman was saying about integrating into formal education. At the moment, I think one of the areas that we are focusing on is the experience that we have with the vulnerable persons in the communities, where we realize that when it comes to disaster time, I'm talking about climate change here in terms of drought and cyclone seasons. We realize that they have experiences, like I say, that a lot of the Pacific Islands have a very strong communal tie. And what I'm referring to here is that they have experiences that are captured informally in the community where they live, that are not absorbed into formal education. The formal, and I'm referring here to primary and secondary and also technical levels, they haven't absorbed this traditional knowledge into their curriculum. And that is what we are working on right now to see how are we going to absorb this into the formal education, especially because we have children and also youth that are in the formal curriculum that don't have the privilege of this knowledge that with their grandma and their grandpa are having at home. And I think that's one area that we are trying to also bring to the platform. A lot of experiences that we find out with the families, especially when it's not documented in the formal curriculum. And I think one of the challenges that we have here is that the formal education people are reluctant, and I think they look on climate change education as the last on the list. Maths education, maths, English, and science are the top on the list. Bottom is climate change education, especially the curriculum that we are looking at to incorporate in the formal education. And again, we have to strike the balance here, because what I referred to earlier, there are people who are not in the formal education. These are the carers and the vulnerable person. And we have to also think up of a module, a special module for them who just stay at home. At the same time, both of them have access to the indigenous knowledge, education experience, and also the informal sector. But what I'm saying here in the Pacific, I think the gentleman from New Zealand realized that we are very slow with catching up to climate change education, targeting the vulnerable person. And Tonga is in that category now. And we are trying to, while we are trying to get the climate change education onto the formal education sector, we also realized that at the same time, there are vulnerable people here that also need the same curriculum. So that's what I can say. And I think, with the Paris Agreement, we need to coordinate this at the regional level because we have similar experiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie.
Thanks. Okay, to start with the first question about integrating traditional knowledge into formal education, the first and most important step is free, prior, and informed consent, which we call FPIC. That is actually making sure that you have the permission of the knowledge holders to actually go ahead and integrate their knowledge into formal education. So it's a very basic first step, but very important and often overlooked. The second, for me, the experiential learning approach is very conducive to bringing in traditional knowledge, because what it does is it allows people to relate the environment to their lives. And in that regard, it's very consistent with traditional learning systems and traditional ways of thinking, where environment and livelihoods and lives and cultures are very, very interconnected. So if we can shift learning formal education systems more towards experiential learning, I think it's a natural organic evolution to start to bring in traditional knowledge. And then finally, student-centered learning whenever this is possible. I did my primary education at a school that happened to be on a First Nations reserve in Canada. It was land of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And so we had many Tsleil-Waututh students within the school. And I remember what the school did is we would have a chapter. This semester we're doing a chapter on the indigenous peoples. But it was taught from the perspective of the teachers. It was never focused on the students. So again, shifting to a student-centered focus on education, allowing students to bring in their own knowledge systems and their own way of learning is a critical part. However, that's very difficult to do because you're talking about changing the very basis of a system. And that needs support from the top. It's not something that you can easily do as a teacher in your own classroom. In terms of how to change appetites, I used to live in a small town in Canada, and I was once driving from my small town to the next one, and I picked up a hitchhiker. And we happened to be talking about the Olympics because Canada hosted the Olympic Games. And he was a member of the Squamish Nation, and he said, I'm so sick of it. Engagement is not a welcome song. And he said, this is the way it's treated. Engagement is not a welcome song. Engagement is true respect starting from the top. And I think this is a part of creating the appetite. Again, it has to come from the top. If policymakers are demonstrating that this is an important part of what they judge when they're looking at an education system. If university entrance exams are saying, all right, are you able to express more than one different type of knowledge? Then we will create an appetite. And I also think to create an appetite, we need to mainstream traditional knowledge, not differentiate it. And this then comes to the example I provided before of where, you don't have a separate chapter on traditional knowledge. This is the mistake I think we made when we worked with Peru on this course on intercultural dialogues. We took it out of the rest of the course of studies and put it on its own. And by doing that, we basically differentiated intercultural dialogue from every other type of learning about environment. And I think that was one of our biggest mistakes. And finally, very quickly, because I know we're short on time, in terms of ensuring that knowledge is not lost, that's definitely a challenge with oral traditions. And it's something that we sitting in the UN, sitting in headquarters in Nairobi, don't really feel empowered to address. All we feel we can do is to bring in some of the processes like circular learning to allow these knowledge systems to persist under new education models. And of course, we're also very supportive of things like you find them sometimes in North Africa and also in Russia, actually, where you have pastoral schools, where basically you take the formal education system and bring it into the community's way of learning. And by doing so, you're not taking students and their learning experience out of their community, but rather are embedding it in it. But I feel that that is not an adequate response to your question. It's merely our small part in helping to address that problem.
Thank you. We have a little bit of time. Manos, this is precisely the stuff of your study you wanted to add to the answers.
I just wanted to mention in response to the first question, which I think is linked to the third question, that and extend what Jamie said. One approach, of course, the overall approach for ensuring that schools are open to other influences is what is called the whole school approach, which tends to look not just at the curriculum, but also at how the school interacts with the community, and of course, how it operates as an organization in terms of its infrastructure, etc. But we do refer to an example from Alaska in the report, where the school operating on its own, through its own autonomy, invited the traditional elders to be part of the teaching and learning process. So it's true that homogenization will not always help. You need local initiative, but you need educators, teachers who feel empowered to do this. And that actually brings me to a question that you raised in the beginning, which we didn't quite answer. How do we feed back scientific information to people? And that's actually a big problem about what is the type of education we're talking about. Because to a large extent, even in countries with privileged students, for example, in OECD countries, we know from the PISA exam that although students tend to be scientifically very literate, however, when it came to express their own views as to how they felt, what was their sense of optimism about whether things could change, only less than 1 in 5 actually felt that things would change in the next 20 years, which actually reminds us that the main thing that education systems should focus, and that applies several times more in the case of marginalized people, is how education systems can empower students, how can they increase their agency, and how educators are prepared to focus on the needs, learning needs, identify the difficulties, and have strategies to tackle the problems of children who are left behind in the learning process. And I think that, to a large extent, holds the answer to what exactly education for sustainable development should be about.
Thank you very much. That reminds me a very famous song by Cat Stevens, when the line goes, "From the moment I could speak, I was ordered to listen." That's maybe exactly the problem. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel, and I would already invite the next panelist to come on stage. Thank you very much, everybody. So our next panel, and I can already start introducing you while you come up. I see Nuhat Awad coming. She is the national coordinator of the Arab Youth Climate Movement in Lebanon, and she has a very dangerous laptop. That's at least what her screensaver says. Then I see to my right Tariq Al-Olaimi, co-founder of 3BL Associates, and I'm sure you're going to explain what that means. We have something in common, as I just realized from your CV. We are both TEDx organizers.
Yes.
You're in your home country, I did TEDx in Bonn, so we have something in common here. And all the way to the right, Jennifer Rubis. Jennifer is from UNESCO and is their program specialist on the natural sciences section on small islands and indigenous knowledge. So UNESCO is institutionally looking into indigenous knowledge. The theme of this second session is practical examples from your work and how you experience that learning can work and should work. And I started with you, and I take a bit of distance from your laptop. And I would invite Nuhat to kick off the second panel. What's your experience, Nuhat?
First, you are safe if you approach it. I would like to share with you a program happened with for Palestinian refugees with the Lebanese students. It was a program on 3 modules. Each module was for 3 months. The main subject or main question of the program was environment does not differentiate between us, why we do. It aimed to teach students between 14 and 18. I would highlight here that the Lebanese were school students, where the Palestinians, some of them were run out of school, but they were from the same age group. So they learned how to use and upscale environmental issues and how to reuse the solid waste to make new things. For example, they learned how to make cars, or we can say vehicles that can run on wind, and also they learned how to make solar energy panels, but from plastic and from aluminum foils. So it was things that can be made. The most interesting thing is that there was several activities done. And at the end, it wasn't like only lecturing, there were videos. And at the end, there was a retreat for 2 days where there was a session on conflict resolution. And each group of students, and here I want to highlight together. So on purpose, the students in each group were mixed of Palestinian and Lebanese. Each group had chose an environmental problem, and they proposed a solution for it, and they videotaped themselves with a message in the video, and these videos were uploaded on YouTube in order for them to share them with their friends and to convince their friends with their point. The most thing I like about this is that they had asked not only for environment issues, they had asked for peace beside the environment, and this was one of the aims. And one of the things that make the program useful is that it didn't concentrate on climate change or an environment. It had answered the needs of the community through environmental project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure there's somewhere a website where we can find the links to all of the YouTube
Yes,
videos.
their program is called United by Environment. It was with Youth Lebanon project.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm certainly going to tweet about this one.
Thank you.
To my right, Tariq, what's your practical example of your work? How do you create learning experience?
So today is World Diabetes Day. Beyond the climate change world, I'm also an ambassador for World Diabetes Day. And in the health world, we've looked very much at linking climate change to diabetes education as well. A few years ago at Rio Plus 20, a report was done by the International Diabetes Federation along with UNESCO and the UNFCCC on looking at the links between the two. And they found that of any 2 issues in the world, diabetes and climate change were one of the most deeply interlinked. But no one really knows this because top 10 diabetes countries per capita exactly correlate with the top 10 emissions per capita. There's links on the transportation system issue, the food issue, Diabetes is the #1 cause of blindness and amputation in the world as well. So it creates marginalized communities. So what we did with the International Diabetes Federation is that we took all this material that had been done in this analysis and started to integrate it into our diabetes education for patients, for doctors, for parents, and beyond. And what we found really worked is that it was climate education, but it looked nothing like climate education. We didn't call it climate education, it was health education, where climate change was a fundamental part and deeply interlinked into it. And I believe this is what made it so successful, because that's what climate education should be. It's not just a module that's sort of kept separate, but it's something that's deeply integrated and linked to many issues.
Well, thank you very much. And I should say, thank you. This was not prompted, but this is precisely what my organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, is promoting.
We should talk after.
Between climate change and nutrition. Excellent. Thank you very much. Jennifer, your practical example.
Okay. First of all, I just like to say how extremely excited I was to hear the first panel talk so much about an issue that's very central to our work and to my heart as an Indigenous person, which is this emphasis on Indigenous knowledge of climate change. It's something we've been working on since 2009 at the LINKS program, the Local and Indigenous Knowledge Systems program. And we have this program to sort of promote the importance and respect of Indigenous knowledge of the environment and its role in environment and its contributions to environmental policy, biodiversity, climate change, for example. But another component of the program is actually on knowledge transmission. And this is actually the roots of the heart of the program. So I'm just going to cite a few examples from the work in terms of biodiversity, just to illustrate how it could be done in a climate change way. For example, one project that we did was with the Mayangna community in Nicaragua, and it started off as a documentation project with, again, as Jamie says, it was what do you call this, put forward by the Mayangna people that they wanted to document particular aspect of the environment, and they decided it would be fish and turtles because they had a huge knowledge of fish and turtles. They did this documentation. They looked at it and they worked with, I think she was a biologist. Apologies, I wasn't really working on that project at the time. So what they did was they put their knowledge into documentation. It became a book. First it became a book. Then they looked at that book and said, well, our children need to know this. And the book was written only in Mayangna, and there was a Spanish version, but it was important to realize that the book and documenting was first produced in their own language. So then they took that material and then they worked with local teachers to then try and produce learning materials. And then after that, they started this process of dialogue with the National Commission on Education to try and get into the formal curricula for the Mayangna people. And so there you see a process. And the process starts with, and I think that was expressed very well in the first panel, this idea of documenting, sitting down, working with Indigenous peoples, working to see how they want their knowledge portrayed, creating the documentation, then working to develop materials. We've done that. We've got a second example, if I'm not taking too much time. It's just we've got a little forum that we used to run since 2009 in cooperation with the CBD as well, called Climate Frontlines. And this is where Indigenous peoples could share their experiences on climate change. We produced a little booklet, and the booklet actually became a little bit of use for non-formal education. It was picked up by Flanders, and that so that they could translate it into their language, so that they could use it in their school system to educate, bring out case studies of how Indigenous peoples were being affected by climate change. So these are some of the ways you can take experiences from Indigenous communities, transform them into either non-formal materials or more formal materials to be used in the system.
Beautiful. Thanks very much. I think all of you showed fantastic example how you reached your communities, but how can you make it more attractive for a broader range of stakeholders? How can you adapt it to different local and regional circumstances? Do you have experiences with that, please?
Yes, I would I would highlight something that the Lebanese government had started, but this is not put online, but I knew from contacts that the UNDP climate change program in the Ministry of Environment in Lebanon had made a training for teachers on how to incorporate climate change even in math. Like instead of saying 5 apples plus 4 oranges, they're gonna say CO2 particles, 5 CO2 particles plus like this is for example. Next year will be the pilot project. I would suggest not only this, but also there is a different projects that had been done, and like 5 booklets have been distributed. So these small projects, I would suggest integrating them with each other and learning from the experience rather than doing pilot projects every now and then, and initiating new alliances between NGOs and academic, and bridging the gap between the academic and the civil society will help to improve the situation. Also, especially Lebanon, should look for local solutions to our local problems. We shouldn't go behind big titles and like what's going in the world. Let us go like we have our problems. We should have our solutions for this. And also, what helps all in this is universities by initiating new programs like MSCs in climate change and sustainable development. This will help in improving the gap, and this will also have academics and have people from inside the community that understand more the community and can help by being inside it. Thank you.
Shukran. I can see that the pupils in Lebanon are getting questions in the masters, like you have 400 ppm in the air, and then a very important election goes wrong. How many ppm do you have now? Tariq, you made a fantastic example about linking the health agenda and the climate change agenda. Can you scale this up? Can you reach different stakeholders group with that? And can you adapt that, as we just heard, to other constituencies and circumstances? How would you do that?
Well, someone was talking, I think, in the audience before about oral knowledge, said it as well, and the importance of that. You know, there's a very beautiful teaching in Morocco, particularly when it comes to the Sufi community, so the inner form of Islam. And they say that you should read nature as if it is scripture itself. And that the beauty of the beloved nature is, in fact, the classroom, the teacher, and the lesson, and the book. And for me, that was always been a very powerful teaching, because very deeply ingrained in these communities for over 1,000 years was a way of being, deeply connected to the environment, of environmental stewardship, that when they talked about the environment and climate, it wasn't just a module that was sort of taught in a class, but it was about being a society that fit into the earth. It was about being a society that was fit for the future. As well, it was about a society that was able to adapt to sort of these changing conditions. And I mentioned that because underlying the changes, whether it's in health education linked to climate change, whether it's in agricultural education linked to climate change, something that the GEM report mentions is that even beyond the technical transition that needs to happen is the value shift and the mind shift that is required. And perhaps that's our biggest challenge. And I think going back to the indigenous communities, especially when it comes to remembering the values in which we want, whether it is health innovations and climate, and agriculture innovations and climate, or political education and climate, that it's coming from the right values. And for us, what we do is make sure everything we do is underpinned by those values. And I mentioned the Moroccan context because it's one that's very close to my heart.
Thank you very much. I put that actually down, the classroom, the teacher, and the book. That's very beautiful. Years ago, I was invited to speak at the World's Parliament of Religions about climate change. And we did that in a way of basically bringing the faith groups in the climate change fight. But then speaking there, I actually realized how much of the environmental and climate agenda is actually common ground and a unifying factor for interreligious dialogue. So I think it also goes both ways, and that's quite exciting. Jennifer, reaching out to other stakeholder groups, how would you do that? How would you adapt to local circumstances?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. The basis of what we're trying to look at is how, um, in a way, there can be that the okay, for me, it starts at the center of the community, making sure what community's knowledge is gets gets up into a public space, that it becomes, it gets transmitted to the next generation. These are the key priorities. Now, we're often, and it's often a little bit of a bottom up approach rather than a top down approach. And so the question for me really is, in terms of scaling up, or trying to, the challenge is then the methodologies. How do you get knowledge from the communities, in a respectful way? You reach out to other stakeholders. One of the examples that we have is we have a pastoralist network. We're working with pastoralists in sub-Saharan Africa, in certain countries, to understand their knowledge, and so that they can document their knowledge of weather forecasting, so traditional weather forecasting. How does a pastoralist know when what the next season will be like? Will it be a drought? Will it be a severe drought? Will it be a disaster for them? And so because of this, they're now getting engaged in a dialogue with meteorologists. And this then becomes very interesting, because then we did a pilot workshop in Chad in 2013, and you could see, you know, pastoralists who would have no formal schooling, but they're experts and they're knowledge holders. They're getting into a conversation with meteorologists about the weather, and this is where you see the knowledge, two knowledge systems trying to come together, trying to understand each other, trying to address a common solution, a problem, and trying to get a solution out of that. And so for me, I would think of this process, if we center it with the community, then you reach out to other stakeholders, but you always have to come. And I guess the key message of what I'm saying is, first, build a capacity of the community to understand and to want to understand, and transmit its knowledge, give it the power to document their knowledge in their own language, and facilitate that, and have a methodology. And this is the key challenge: how can indigenous communities have this methodology so that they can do it in their communities, and then bring out, and then have this process of knowledge education coming both ways, then, if that makes sense.
It
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I was just, while you're saying that, also thinking again about your question of oral history. Everyone has almost everyone has today a smartphone. So if you have oral history, you can record the stories, you can video the stories, you can make them available for more people. So I think it actually has become easier to tap into the wealth of storytelling, of oral tradition. Next question. Where should we invest? Where do we put our money? Where do we put our energy in order to make learning more inclusive and really leaving no one behind when it comes to climate change education? And I start with you again.
I would suggest starting from a local level by initiating a center that is responsible for having textbooks and for initiating capacity buildings, and teaching not only students and also teachers about the importance of climate change and incorporating sustainable development into the curricula. Then we go into the regional by having an action plan for the Arab region. And this action plan can be helped by the international by having communication with the secretariat, and helping in implementing this action plan on the regional level. And the international on the international level, we can on the national and regional, we can get help by capacity building and by exchanging information. They can know about our experience and about what we learned from different projects, and we can learn from them, and exchange not only information but also get the capacity building needed and technology transfer for this.
Thanks very much. That's a very clear game plan. Thank you very much. Tariq.
So, I mean, firstly, to say with the GEM report that was being talked about, and has fantastic recommendations. I won't repeat them, but I encourage everyone to read them. And actually, when I was reading them, it made me recall the African proverb that says to educate and raise a child, you need a whole village. And it actually made me think that actually, when it comes to climate change education, you need a whole village to educate itself. It is no longer sort of adults to youth. a really truly whole institution approach and a lifelong learning approach. We need to make sure our schools and our universities at every single level of the education experience have climate education integrated into it. But of course, most of the decisions that are being made also with the Paris Agreement and beyond are being made by adults who are no longer in the education system. And I think immediately our biggest concern and investment needs to go into adult literacy of, I think, climate change, made even more so by recent political developments, and I think the need for that. And we need to make sure that we're developing lifelong learning approaches in institutions, which is also at the core of UNESCO philosophy, to make sure that someone who is in his 60s and 70s just as equally has an opportunity to be climate literate as someone who's younger and has access to all this education. And I think as a young person, it often pains me that our marginalized communities are also our elders, actually. It's not just that we need to take from our elders when it comes to their stories, but we also need to give back and give them just as an equal opportunity to contribute.
Thanks very much. And what you say about lifelong learning brings me to one point. You just mentioned the recent elections. There's an element of urban versus rural, where the rural population has more tendency to be more conservative in their voting. But I would take it one further. If you really go to people who really are rural and work with nature and are beekeepers or agriculturists or pastoralists, you wouldn't find them challenging climate change because they feel it quite directly. Because it's really the poorest of the poor who are in most direct contact with nature and are most dependent of the natural resources. So I just wanted to make this case that rural doesn't mean not educated. Jennifer, priority areas for investing our time and money.
Yes, of course, I'm going to say, of course, we invest in the communities. We, like I said earlier, we should put in place systems, and we should both in policy and support to try and make sure that they're able to document and understand their language, that they're able to communicate what they're observing in terms of climate change, that they're able to communicate how they respond to the impacts of climate change. The other thing I think that is very important to invest in is in mother tongue education. I saw this statistic from the GEM report earlier, the first slide. It said 40% of children are educated in a language they don't receive education in a language they don't understand or speak. I thought that was a very powerful statistic, and it says a lot. What we have to realize, and I think a lot of speakers on the first panel also echoed that you know, that knowledge of the environment is so embedded in the language, and it's concepts that are not easily translated into Western languages, and it's certainly not easily translated into Western science. So if we want to keep those observations, if we want to pass them on, if we want for people to understand, mother tongue education, very, very important.
Thank you very much. I have another question, but at this point, I would also like to open the floor already, and maybe we can bundle the last set of questions. While you think about your question, please, the gentleman over there. I could just basically say a very simple question. We are in this room, national actors, international actors, regional actors. What is it that we should be doing? But let's bundle the questions, and sir, you have the floor for your question.
Okay, it'll be short. Much of climate change education is based on fear and scare. And I'm wondering if you have any experience in how to turn that around, because an awful lot of young people do not want to become involved in it. It's a real downer. So if you have any insight into that.
Thank you very much. Changing the narrative around climate change. Any more questions? Yes, there is a lady on the left-hand side. Okay.
I will go first.
Okay, please. Sorry, I didn't see you. The light is very bright
Yeah,
here.
this is more of a small intervention. I want to thank Tariq for making the connection between spirituality and climate change education. I think we cannot change anything if we cannot first change ourselves. And climate change is a symptom. I really perceive it as one that humans need not simply smarter solutions, but kinder hearts. And the core of our discussion today is really more of a quest of meaning and a spiritual quest about human identity. And it's not about education separate from climate change, or it's all entangled. And I would like to end with a question I like to ask my students in Tribe of Why. I always say, what would our industry look like if our inventors were kind?
Thank you very much. The lady all the way to the left in the red dress. If it doesn't work, just come up here and take this microphone.
Thanks. My name is Anu from Nigeria. In developing countries, we know that poverty is not a disease any longer. It's a mindset. Now, for education to be implemented in terms of climate change in such a way that it's going to be domesticated in the minds and in heart of the people, especially in rural areas, what are the creative process, the creative procedures and the plans to ensure that education is well implemented and being transferred to a positive influenced individual behavior? Because in one of our projects which we were doing in Nigeria, Green Summer School, we noticed that, fine, those people, they are poor. And because they are poor, they don't want to hear anything than what they want to hear, than means of survival. And that has actually been an object of obstruction for us in order to pass the information of climate change to them. Now, at this point, how can we tackle such problem?
Thank you very much. And please give the microphone just to the lady to your left-hand side. Thank you.
My name is Monica. I'm from Lisbon University. I'm a student. After all, congratulations for your passion. We can feel it. It's a good feeling. And I would like to know, what do you think about the media role in communication? Because I was journalist and I travel and I work as a journalist for 3 years. And in the beginning, I thought it was a good way to communicate and to give information to the public sphere. But now I have a different opinion. So I would like to know, what do you think about it?
Well, thank you very much. Excellent questions. The actors, the narrative of fear and scare, change for something positive, the spiritual dimension of it, the individual behavior and the self-change, what is needed, and the role of the media. And allow me to go from right to left to end this panel discussion, and then after that, Angus is going to wrap up the session. Please, go ahead.
Okay, very interesting questions. I'll try my best to answer them. I think what's important from us, because the Links program works with very remote communities, in indigenous communities. How we try to reach out is just to allow the voices of the people who are most affected by climate change to speak. For us, that's well, frankly, that's the only thing we can do. And in a way, it's very interesting because there's such a for me, I personally find it very empowering, because at the same time, there is this narrative of people who are observing very, very rapid changes in their environment. But at the same time, they are also saying, we have the knowledge, we are trying to cope with this. And of course, there are different messages, and it's very complex. And we can get into that in a whole different session about the limits to adaptation and all of that. But I think what's key here is to try and connect the voices of the people who are most affected by climate change, to allow their voices to speak, to find ways that this can translate into the public domain. And we see. What else? What was it? What else? And I think that's, in a way, that's also relates to the role of the media as well, because again, it's it's allowing this connection that that we can hope that that the world can see that that climate change is happening. It's not something that's just scientific statistics or forecasts and probabilities and pathways. It's things that are happening now, in spaces where people aren't being heard very well. And so having that connection, I think, is very important, and bringing that out in a very how you do it depends on the medium, of course, but then the important thing is that we try to find the channels for these messages to get heard.
Thank you very much, Tariq.
So maybe to start with sort of fear, which is something that I've looked into quite a lot. I mean, the reality is, when it comes to the human mind and the human brain, it evolved at a time where we didn't have complexity. We have a cognitive bias, which is we are more wired 80% of the time to pay attention to fear rather than hope and optimism. That has driven the media industry as well, which is what sells papers, unfortunately. And it becomes even harder then for educators to make sure that we do focus on optimism. And one sort of solution as well from a cognitive, I think, level is looking at exponential mindsets. We think linearly, we think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We don't necessarily think exponentially. And there's some fantastic organizations, particularly led by NASA, which is focused on education that is exponential driven. And I'm happy as well to talk about that sort of later, which has been, I think, for me, a very powerful sort of counter narrative, one that focuses on hope and abundance and leads to incredible innovations. And then linking it to the inner spiritual dimension, I think there is that as well. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh would say that actually the biggest reason we don't care about climate change, or people don't pay attention, is that if you really think about it, it is an incredible emotional disturbance for someone. Someone who's going through day-to-day issues, dealing with I can't put food on the table, etc. It's very difficult to even comprehend something like climate change, like your island being destroyed completely. And I don't think we have the true emotional response as well to that. And I think that's something we need as educators to bring in, sort of deeper into that spiritual, I think, an emotional dimension as well as the optimism. In relation to the question of what would our industries look like if they were kinder, I have a bias towards nature. I'd say it would look like nature. I'm a biomimicry specialist, which is my role and my background is learning from nature and trying to emulate nature. And we see from nature that the true measure of success is that life creates conditions conducive to life. And I would say if our industries were kind, it would be doing that. It'd be creating those conditions to make sure that life flourishes not only for humans, but for all species.
Thank you very much. Wise words. And if you consider that if we wouldn't interfere with nature, out of 999,999, out of 1 million carbon molecules, 999,999 are constantly recycled, yes, because otherwise we wouldn't have life on Earth. Yes. I think we get a gist of what you just said, Tariq. What, you have the last word?
I don't have much to add, but I want to answer the question about fear. Like always, some people answers me like, why you are making all of this fuss about climate change? Lebanon only emits 0.07 out of all the greenhouse gases emissions. I answered them like, it's not about how we emit, it's about the effect of climate change. You can see people in the rural areas are affected by the waterfall, and the agriculture is getting affected. And here comes also the issue of spiritual, when we say that it's our duty toward others and our duty toward our world. And last year, the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, had suggested having yoga as a way to improve climate change, by saying that if we improve our lifestyle and if we've been one with nature, we're gonna help in fighting climate change. Also, for the question of media, media are biased. Media only cares about things that get people interested. They are not covering environmental issues as it should be. And even like I would tell you, from even a single project that has like this one about refugees, or another one as planting trees in a certain village, you cannot find anybody to cover you, or except like a web page that that's really there for 1 year, but like big media channels don't cover environmental issues. They only like scandals and other these issues. Also in Lebanon, we lack journalism in environment. So you cannot find a specialist in this. Some I know like there is Professor Habib Malouf who was writing for 10 years a page every Tuesday in As-Safir, and this year stopped. Yani, the issue is not improving, it's decreasing. And it's very hard to have a journalist that's only dealing with environmental because he cannot live from this. So this is a problem. And really, like I would call from here for media to help NGOs and academics and play an important role in highlighting and standing in this issue, especially that some media channels are politicized, not only in Lebanon, but also in the world. Concerning how we try to reach out, question, it's by raising awareness, and it's by giving proof from on-ground projects, not only saying numbers or saying what's happening in other places, but providing by pictures, by numbers, by social media, and what's going on and how it should be improved. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much. We've been very good with the time. I have 50 seconds before I hand the floor to Angus, and I'm going to use them because I want to say two things. One, on the media, I think it's not only not quality media, but there's also a catch with quality media. Quality journalism is always compelled to give the floor, to give a word to both sides of the argument. And that makes it tricky in the climate change world, because you got 3,000 plus serious scientists who all speak with one voice, and then you got 5 paid loonies who say the opposite, but you find them in every single talk show. So there is actually a problem with quality journalism as well. And coming out of a journalistic household, I fully sympathize with it, but it's difficult actually to make this case for it. The second point on the narrative, which I just wanted to touch upon very briefly, is, and that also relates to questions that came from you on spirituality and all of this, I truly believe that a solution for climate change can only be found if we step up to the next level of international cooperation. So in itself, that's beautiful, because human civilization has been evolving from very small circles, your family, your tribe, to bigger circles, to nations, and then to regional cooperatives like the United States or the European Union or the African Union. And now it's really time to move to the next step and understand ourselves as global citizens and base our cooperation on this one. I would just briefly like to introduce Angus Mckay from the Green Development and Climate Change Program of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. He's going to do my job in wrapping up this session. So I just have to say, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists and for their passion, as you said, for the topic.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. Please stay where you are. I won't keep you long. And of course, I should start by thanking you very much, Martin. We've not had a chance to work together before, but you did a masterful job. So I want to extend the applause to you as well for keeping us on track, but also the flow of the discussion within the panel and also with the group. I think it was Tariq who said, you said a number of things actually, but one of the things you said was you referred to older people as potentially being a group that was had a chance of being left behind, particularly with the sort of the information, the technological revolution, and so on. And I think I just about nearly qualify in that category. I'm coming up to an important birthday here, but I also have a 14-year-old son who is just so streets ahead of me when it comes to, you know, finding information, picking up information, making the connections, and so on. So what it made me realize is, to some extent, depending on the perspective that you have, we're probably all of us, one way or the other, being left behind. And from that is the relatively obvious point, but important one, significant one, I think, that it's not a binary issue. It's a very multidisciplinary, multi-directional issue. And I think it was at least one of the panelists referred to the fact that we're really only beginning to understand the nature of this problem. And I think, you know, a lot more research is needed, a lot more of this sort of discussion is going to be needed. And what we hope, you know, today is that we have made a small contribution, but also that we can start a discussion and a dialogue. And we certainly do not, you know, looking back in a few years from now, I hope we will have all contributed to this. And it won't just be, oh, that was quite a nice session that we had in Marrakesh. I started off feeling really very quite excited listening to the context of all of this and the kinds of sort of lines in which the discussion was going. And then, and I think a number of people in the room picked this up, and I think, you know, I actually ended up feeling quite moved, frankly, by the passion and also the way that the panelists have made their point deeply felt and so on. And that was really quite an interesting moment around about the middle where we sort of pivoted. And then I ended up feeling excited again. I'm quite excited now because of the number of solutions and ideas that have come out of this forum. And look, we're only, what, 50 or so in the room. You know, imagine if we had a full room. I mean, this is a, you know, a tremendous opportunity, I think, to really try to understand what we mean. When we talk about Agenda 2030, what do we mean by reaching the furthest first? And I personally believe that this is a very revolutionary term. I'm not sure whether everyone has picked this up. I don't think it's about reaching the furthest. It's about reaching the furthest first, which means that those that are excluded, that have not been at the center of education for climate change or environment, it's not that we should do a little bit more for these groups. It's that they need to be put at the center of what we're doing for Agenda 2030. And I think we're only just beginning to understand the implications of what that really means. Look, I'm not going to re-summarize everything, but a few key messages. When we talk about leaving no one behind, it's very clear that it means two things. It's both leaving no one behind as consumers of education for climate change and environment, but also as providers. And that this is a two-way street, and this is particularly the case for climate change. We know very well that if we live in an area that is vulnerable to climate change, vulnerable to disasters, it's indigenous knowledge in many cases that's going to help us surmount those challenges. So that came across very clearly. Louisa talked about, at the same time, that there's a reluctance. Where is Louisa? That there's a there you are. That there's a reluctance amongst formal education providers to absorb new types of knowledge, new types of education, indigenous knowledge, and so on. And from that, this whole issue of respect was another key theme, I think, of the discussion. That it's a two-way thing. Both sides have to learn from each other. We mustn't be afraid of that. That seemed to me to be another area that came across quite strongly. But also, as I said earlier, much more understanding to sort of unpack some of these issues. I mean, the Tonga experience of working with carers in the community, and that these carers are key transmitters of knowledge and education, and also that it works both ways, was, you know, starting to unpack that. But there's so much more that we need to know. The exciting bit in the second session, where we started talking about practical measures, came through. You know, there was a lot of talk about getting the messaging right, not starting with environment and climate change, but starting with issues that communicate with people's everyday lives. And I think there was an experience from Palestine on that. That makes a lot of sense. And also the diabetes experience was in a similar vein of integration, linking it to what's affecting people's lives, and not starting with this fear message, even though we may be, to some extent, hardwired to operate in this way. But there's no reason why we can't challenge that. Jennifer talked about, also talked about the process of needing to sort of document knowledge, be systematic, develop new types of educational materials, and also the leadership necessary from all levels to make sure that this that this happens. And Tarek, you also talked about this value shift needed, and by definition, you know, in any two-way dialogue, I mean, you know, if you're going to have a value shift, you've got to have that two-way dialogue. So that was also a very, you know, sort of inspiring element, I think, of the discussion we had. Where do we go from here? I mean, you know, we're not going to set up a committee or, you know, a panel, but, you know, what I think we must do is to reflect very strongly when we talk about education and climate change on some of the messages that came out of this discussion. I hope that we'll be able to record them in some way. I've written down some notes. And come back to this. So, I want to thank you all for coming. I think we've got, we're a couple of minutes before time, and I know it's been a long day. And once again, both panels, excellent discussion. I hope you've benefited and felt that it was useful, and do come and talk to us afterwards. We'll be around, and I wish you a very good evening. Thank you very much.
Can I highlight something? Sure. I'm happy, I'm seeing here a person talking from UNITAR. I want to highlight that the first course about climate change, it was an online course taught by UNITAR. It was the first specific course I took it about climate change, although I have an undergrad in environmental health and a master's in environmental sciences, and no single course was about climate change. So thank you for all your work.